Hello, everyone. This is Gaurav Kapoor. Thanks for joining our session at the Intellis conference. I'm here joined by Dan Cassidy from Idorsia Pharmaceuticals. We've recorded this session separately, but we're still going to go through the whole presentation together. The title of our discussion today is, Can Innovation in Market Research Drive Better or Winning Messaging Campaigns, especially for new drug launches? So let's just jump right in. We'll actually hope to have a lively discussion during or after the conversation. So let's talk about the innovation that has happened in market research already over the last 10 some years. A lot has actually improved, and a lot of new exciting things are happening. Number one, in terms of just how primary market research is done, there's a lot of agile research technologies that have now emerged, which are allowing researchers to kind of conduct their own research. So they don't have to scope out projects. They can be much more nimble and agile. These micro survey, DIY survey platforms are really transforming how a lot of research teams are actually now getting feedback from customers. How they actually get respondents to participate in the research has also changed quite a lot. So more and more teams are now in many industries. In the pharmaceutical industry, it's a little bit different, but in many other industries, more and more research teams are building their own first-party databases and using them as like instead of a panel, using customers who are in their first-party databases to get feedback from them on an ongoing, continuous basis. In the survey, in primary market research, now there's a lot of newer techniques that are being used, more inspired by emotion science or behavioral science, trying to get to the bottom of, trying to get deeper insights about how or why customers are actually behaving the way they're behaving. The data that comes out of the survey, whether it's quant or quant, is now being visualized in many interesting ways that were not possible before. And therefore, the reporting and sharing of data from the research is actually quite interesting and exciting now that we've never been able to do that before. And finally, AI is being used in so many ways to perhaps even actually reduce the amount of research that is needed. And mining past market research from using text analytics, et cetera, getting new insights from market research that has already been done, because most brand teams have more research than they can actually use. So this is also a lot of interesting innovation has happened in this place. Now, we're focused more on this session on message testing research. So let's look at the innovation, or rather lack of innovation, in message testing research that has happened over the last, same 10-year period. And focusing more on what would one need when you're testing messages in primary market research. What would you ideally want to be able to do? And is that possible today? And if it wasn't possible 10 years ago, has improvement been made in this on this front? So today, if you look at the choices that are available to us to test messages, qualitatively, you can test messages in IDIs, TDIs, etc. Quantitatively, you can use more conventional survey type of approaches to test messages, and then you can also use more advanced, like choice-based type of max-diff turf type of methodologies as well. Either way, there are many limitations that still apply today that were in place 10 years ago. We still can't test a lot of messages in one study. It's physically not possible to do that, even when you're using quant. Now, what do I mean by a lot of messages? Like more than 50 messages, more than whatever. So pick a number. Somebody may say, why do we need to test so many messages? We'll talk more about this in later in the slides, that testing more messages allows you to improves your chances of finding better or winning messaging campaigns. So that's a restriction today. When you're testing more or lots of messages, one of the problems you run into in primary market research is then you start getting the sea of sameness type of response, i.e., a lot of messages don't differentiate or discriminate in scores based on the research. So how you got the scores, ratings, rankings, utility scores, etc. The separation is actually not there, which then makes the decision making after the research more difficult, because like how do you now you have to layer your judgment on top of it to decide which messages should you really move forward with, or should be in your visit, or should be in your messaging campaign. If you invested a lot of time and effort in testing messages in research, and then none of them tested that well, if you were benchmarking them against norms, or even just otherwise top 2 box scores, then what do? Go back all the way to the drawing board and develop more or new, better messages, and then spend a whole bunch of more time and money to actually test them again? That's also not very practical. So that's also a limitation about, can we actually improve messages as or even before we test them? If you want to know why people like or don't like certain message, you have to ask. There really isn't a good way of getting that information silently out of the respondent. You can do A/B testing in the real world, but even that doesn't. It tells you which one won, but it doesn't quite tell you why. And then a lot of primary market research is focused more on identifying what are the top X number of winning messages, whatever that number is, 3, 4, 5, 10, and less about what is the optimal bundle and story flow of messages that your campaigns should be based on. And then if you're really going to use that type of an approach, are the deliverables from market research campaign ready, or are you having to use a lot of what you get out of primary market research, which is typically the output of a max diff turf would be a rank order or a hierarchy of messages, and then a kind of like, if you were going to use only 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 messages, what would they be? That's the most common output that one gets. That is not ready for campaigns yet. There's much more work to be done, which is taken on by the marketing team and the agency partners to then translate that into campaigns. So there's still lots of, you can even think of them as basic or unmet needs when we want to do message testing. So for whatever reason, not that as much innovation has been infused into message testing research as into other forms of market research. So just to kind of build a little bit more about this concept of campaign readiness and how the current message testing research solutions that are available in the marketplace are like the deliverables of those are not as campaign ready as they can and should be. So if the market research deliverables are mostly a rank order or a hierarchy of messages and some kind of a turf type of analysis, think about what the marketing team needs. If you were to say they're totally campaign ready now, they would ideally need an omni-channel, segment-based or segment customized message map, right? So for every channel, for every segment of customers, they have exactly what bundle of messages we need to use to execute in this campaign, and what is the precise order and sequence of messages in that bundle. That would be a message map or a playbook, whatever terminology you want to use internally within your organization, that would be considered you are now campaign ready. So what we want to show is how innovation in message testing research is possible, and how it can close this campaign readiness gap that we just kind of outlined. So where is this innovation coming from or can come from? By combining two emerging fields of research in the area of R&D, if you will, that can help us test messages in primary market research differently. And then the output of the research is used differently also to drive greater campaign readiness. Using decision heuristic science in the research and even before research, how you actually test messages in primary market research can be significantly kind of almost transformed or evolved if you were to apply decision heuristic science to it. We're going to talk more about this in a second. The data that comes out of the research, if you use, normally that data would go into SPSS or SAS or something like that. And you would essentially be doing more conventional statistical analyses. If you were to use artificial intelligence on that data from the survey, you could now use the output, or use that data to generate deliverables or output that reduce the number of steps that are required to get to campaign readiness. It becomes much more direct line of sight from research to execution, which not only improves your speed to market, it also improves the accuracy of the campaigns that you're launching. What do I mean by that? A lot of human judgment is infused into the process when people are actually taking the output of market research and translating that into messaging campaigns and marketing campaigns. Think about how many times you have experienced that situation, that the messages you tested versus the messages that actually got launched into the market, how similar or dissimilar they were. and not, some of those changes were because of legal and LMR feedback, but not all of them, or in fact many of them were not. So a lot of de-optimization actually happens after the research and before the campaign materials are finalized. And by using machine learning algorithms or AI, you can actually reduce this de-optimization, if you will. So what are the benefits of using this kind of combined approach in message testing? Number one, if you're using behavioral science or decision heuristic science to test messages differently in research, it allows you to test a lot more messages in one study. You can potentially test hundreds of messages, and you don't have to exponentially increase your panel size and spend a lot more time in the field either. Not only can you test messages, you can actually improve messages using the exact same science. Decision heuristic science can be used to manipulate or carefully curate language in a message that makes the message more persuasive, or creates many different alternative versions of that one message, which can now all be tested in the research. If you're using behavioral science or decision heuristic science in the research, in how you test messages, this can allow you to also get better separation in scores between messages, because using heuristics, you can customize what messages or message bundles are shown to a respondent, talking to their specific personal heuristics, forcing them to make better or tougher decisions rather, and getting better data in the process. You can also use this exact same science to get the signal on what inside a message is driving the appeal of the message without having to ask stated or diagnostic questions. Now, coming out of the research, using AI allows you to actually do new things that you couldn't do before. If you did test or start with a lot of messages, and you also had lots of alternative versions of any message as well, then you are going to have a very large search space of possibilities of message bundles that could be used for your campaigns. Using AI to identify the very best bundles of messages more algorithmically can significantly improve how successful your campaigns are. And then finally, using AI, you can also identify not just an overall kind of message campaign strategy type of message bundle, you can identify the precise optimal message bundles for every channel, for every segment of customers, that could then be translated into digital display, or it could be in page by page of your visit, or it could be to design a landing page on your website, whatever, like channels of communications your campaign was planning to utilize for every single channel. And if you have the ability to segment, personalize things, you could actually use AI to give you or bring you to that level of execution. How? Let's talk about how exactly this gets done. So walking through 4 steps. Number 1, before you go into research. Normally, conventional message testing methodologies, before you go into research, you really don't have to do anything. The marketing team or the brand team, it has to basically prepare and develop their messages. Once they're ready, you take the messages and basically program them into the survey, no matter what kind of methodology you were planning to use. There's not much work required to in advance of the research to change it to do anything other than kind of just prepare the survey. If you're using this science, you'll actually have to do a very different set of tasks before the research is even starting. Starting with the messages that the brand team has actually developed, let's call them original messages. Those messages first need to be put through machine learning algorithms to identify or reverse engineer the decision heuristic out of every message. The language in that message can be used as a signal for a decision heuristic that could out of potentially hundreds of decision heuristics. This information, why do we need this information? This information is very valuable and it could be utilized live during the survey. We'll talk about that in a second. This information could also be used before the survey is actually even fielded to generate new alternative versions of every message, either using the same heuristic, but now changing the language, or perhaps even switching the heuristic that the original message was written to, utilizing a different heuristic, and now creating a more even different version of this message, but saying the same or communicating the same information that was in the original message. All of these messages now go into the research where respondents are participating in a quantitative research survey. Using not just the messages you're testing, but the underlying heuristics behind those messages, you can now test messages individually, and you can also generate bundles of messages in real time based on respondent feedback, customizing messages and message bundles to each respondent's decision heuristics. Normally, market research calls for randomizing what exposures are shown to each respondent. This type of an approach you don't want to randomize, because randomization also results in a lot of bad or just unproductive exposures to respondents, right? You're showing them messages that are not really relevant to them, which you could have avoided that and put a choice in front of them that was far more, every option in that choice was actually really relevant, and therefore would have forced them to make much tougher decisions, which is similar to what they have to do in real life, and you would get better data out of that choice set. The data from the research is then fed into like an AI type of platform. Here, now you can actually more algorithmically identify bundles of and story flow of messages out of, it could be billions or even trillions of possibilities. It doesn't really matter. This is where the power of kind of AI can come in very handy. And now you can also, if you have some way of applying some kind of a rules engine within AI that could then help you identify the optimal message bundle and story flow for each segment, for different channels of communications. If you were able to generate rules, you can now take this all the way where the output of the research is not just a PowerPoint deck, which contains a rank order of messages and here's a turf analysis. It actually is a message playbook or message map that is omni-channel segment-based message map that the marketing team can then pick up and get ready to execute. So just we're going to share with you the The success of this type of an approach in basically infusing behavioral science or decision heuristic science into message testing research and then using AI to analyze the data from the research. What is the upside of doing this? So we're going to share the upside in two ways. One is using more of a meta-analysis type of an approach across many studies. And then we'll talk a specific case study which was done for Idorsia Pharmaceuticals, which will be interesting to learn about how that process works and what the insights came out of this whole process. So meta-analysis first. Looking across almost 30 different research projects where messages were tested with respondents, physicians, or patients. These studies were done across 20 different brands, pharmaceutical brands, 22 different disease states. There were almost 6,500 respondents participating in this research. There were almost 4,800 messages tested across these research studies. And this was done over 3 years. So it's a fairly substantial meta-analysis. And so all the messages tested here in these studies were utilizing this behavioral science plus AI type of approach. So this creates a robust kind of data set that we can study to see what was the output. And so just giving you 3 quick data points across to evaluate the effectiveness of this whole new approach of message testing. What's the output? And all of these metrics that we're going to use, they're basically based on preference share for any bundle of messages based on how the data from the research. So let's that's the common metric that's being used across all of these different results. So first thing, 100% success rate. How is that defined? Every single project where this methodology was used, the optimal message bundle and story flow that was identified by testing messages in this way outperformed the preference share of that bundle was significantly higher than the preference share of any benchmark that was used. So especially the current in-market, if it was an in-market drug that already had messaging, the preference share of that messaging or that message bundle versus the preference share of the new message bundle that was identified through this process was higher, and it was every single time, every single study, it was higher on a statistical significant basis. Now, how much better was the preference share? 1.7 times higher. So 70% improvement in the effectiveness of your messaging or your message bundles and story flow is a very significant increase versus where the brand is right now. Imagine if your market share improved 70%. That would be, now market research results don't directly translate into the marketplace because there's so many other spending and other variables, competitive variables. But just think about the level of improvement using the preference share metric. Also, market leadership improved, meaning 7 out of 10 brands that the new message bundle that was identified through this way of testing messages, the new message bundle, which had been kind of algorithmically and scientifically optimized, improved the leadership, the preference share of that brand increased versus its direct competitors. If that brand was already in the lead, they widened the lead. If they were behind, they closed the gap. Every single brand improved their competitive situation as a result of the optimizing their message bundle and story flow using this type of a methodology. So the results are promising in that there can be this type of innovation in message testing can lead to better winning or more effective messaging campaigns. Normally, if you ask somebody to say, if you wanted to if you wanted your messaging campaign to be more successful in the marketplace, what would you need to do? The answer typically would be you would need to start with, you need better messages, you would need better insights, you would need better messages. Almost never would people say you would need to test messages differently. How you test messages, we are mostly trained to think doesn't really impact which messages rise to the top in your overall campaigns and how successful those campaigns are. And this type of an analysis actually suggests otherwise. How you test messages does, can and does have an impact on which messages are going into your campaigns and what message bundles are you going to use and what story flow you're going to use to create your different marketing or campaign assets, and then therefore how successful those assets will be. So it's an interesting finding and suggests like, room for improvement in message testing research. Now, I mentioned that we're going to also kind of look at an individual case study, this case study, we're going to kind of de-identify or disguise the brand name or the product name and even the disease state here. But it is real, and it's basically optimizing messaging campaigns for a drug launch. So let's dive right in.
Hey, Gaurav, thanks very much for the opportunity to join you today in the presentation regarding optimizing messaging for campaigns for drug launches. So before I kind of get started in my section, I just wanted to back up to let everybody know as to why we chose Newristics for our message testing. So I've been working with Gaurav and Heuristics and Channing for about the last 10 years. And the reason why I chose them is that Newristics was by far the most innovative company doing messaging work over that time period. In a prior life within pharma, I had first started out market research, then went to the field as a sales rep, and then came back into market research. And what I really found that frustrated me as a sales rep and why messaging has been so important to me is that many times when we were using a visual aid, oftentimes we would, as a sales rep, you would actually rework the message so you could speak it in common language. One of the things that had always frustrated me when I was a rep is that a lot of messages were written in what I always call pharma speak, and that is not actually how HCPs talk. It's not how sales representatives talk. It's not how an MPPA talks. So a lot of times you rework a message, and just felt like that wasn't a right thing to do once I came back inside and was working on visual aids again, because when you're working on messaging, obviously words matter, and words matter a lot. So when I was introduced to heuristic-based messaging from Gaurav, I thought the messages were just far more impactful and that they had a stickiness to them. And a lot of this was just because it's based in behavioral science, the use of perceptions and biases. So the other thing that's really important about heuristics is that it's used in common language. As I said, the stickiness factor is really high. And you're using common everyday language, like almost kitchen table speak, as I call it, rather than pharma speak, which are these over clinical messages that no one would actually say. So a lot of times when you're in the field, you're reworking that message so you can communicate it clearly to a physician. And I felt like that was the biggest weak point that we had in pharma messaging. So on to the next slide. We're launching a new drug, and we've got some challenging circumstances. The category that we're launching into is a very large category, but there is a declining market due to some patent drop-offs and also some safety issues within the category. There's a lot of non-pharmacological treatments, options that are widely used, a lot of OTC products that are stacked on top of prescription-based products. And as I alluded to, there is a safety issue in the category regarding physical dependence issues, which tend to be a barrier to patient compliance. So they're the category challenges. We also have some company challenges as well, or challenges that our company was experiencing going into this market. So we have a very innovative MOA. We also have a very clean safety profile that counters some of that category challenge. One of the challenges, though, we're the third product to market in the class that we will be competing in. Now, there is a bit of a negative class effect from the first drug that was launched. The first drug was launched, provided, and gave a very valiant effort to opening up a new opportunity and a new class of drugs within the category. Unfortunately, the way the product was dosed, they ran into some very significant challenges. And while they gave it a valiant effort, it proved not to be as effective in the perception of both patients and HCPs, and was not really able to deliver on the brand promise. The third one is that this is our very first commercial product, and that we're launching for the organization. So all eyes are on us, and there's a lot riding on this, and we're doing a lot of things actually for the very first time. So we're not only standing up an organization, but we're also standing up and launching our first product into a very large competitive genericized market. On to the next slide. So a little bit around some of the study objectives and what we were trying to accomplish. We're trying to create a winning HCP and patient messaging playbook for the launch. So what we were trying to do is get the HCP and the patient messages as close to one another as possible. So that communication is pretty fluid between those conversations of HCP and consumer. So one is, we were trying to improve the messages prior to the research. We tested a large number of original messages that our agency partner had developed. And then we partnered with Newristics to develop heuristicized messages. So there were a significant number of messages, as you'll see in the next slide, that were developed by our agency, and we wrote an equal or almost an equal heuristicized message for each one of those that went into testing. And number two is that we were trying to identify winning message bundles and a story flow out of many, many messages to guide the campaign strategy. So identifying that winning bundle was very, very critical for us. And then number three is to generate campaign-ready message bundles, in order to activate any kind of segments or channel-level personalization was really important. So the thing that I wanted to come out of the messaging research is that it could feed right into a visual aid, and we could kind of move forward from that. And then fourth is to predict the likely performance of the message campaign versus our competitors. Now, what's really unique about the Newristics message platform is you can also touch the messages of your competitors in a quant format, and how your messages would compete against competitive messages. And that will be, we believe, in those four different factors here will drive a winning launch campaign. Now, when we look at the study design, we were trying to optimize the physician and patient messaging, as I had said before, to get them as closely aligned as possible. So when we tested messages, we went in and tested 109 original messages that were developed by our agency. Newristics then developed almost 80 messages here that were heuristicized messages. So it was almost one for every message that the agency wrote. Newristics also wrote a heuristicized message. Now, on the patient side of the study, while we didn't test as many as we did on the HCP side, we still tested about 140 messages overall, and that was almost one for every original message that was developed by the agency. We also tested a heuristicized message that was developed by Newristics. Now, there were 8 messages, and those messages were across 8 message attributes, such as efficacy, safety, dosing, and whatnot. And when you combine all of those, you get billions and billions of possible message bundles. So, here on the HCP side, there's about 36 billion different combinations. And on the patient side, it's about 2.8 billion. So a significant number of different ways that you could combine these messages. When we looked at the overall sample size, we were talking to 250 HCPs, 250 patients. So a good size sample. So, we thought that the message bundles coming out of this are going to be very, very reliable. And we benched that sample size against 4 competitors in the market. 2 were genericized and 2 were branded players in the market. And coming down to how many heuristics were actually in the category, there were about 21, on the physician side and about 20 on the patient side. And a lot of these heuristics were very common with one another. So how, you might be asking is, how were heuristics used to improve the messages before research? So how the process works is that the agency will develop an original product message, such as this one on the left, that product X is available in a single nightly dose. And another way you could write those messages based on different heuristics here through alternative 1, 2, and 3 is an alternative 1. Another way you could write it is product X requires only 1 dose every night. And that heuristic is the focusing effect. Another alternative would be once daily nighttime dosing. And that heuristic is a rule of consistency. And then the third alternative here was simple to take 1 dose every night. And that heuristic was complication bias. So you can see there's a lot of different ways to write messages. And usually I find that the heuristic-based messages are often far more stickier than the standard approach that you will get from your agency of record. So let's look at kind of the platform of what we had come out with at the end of working with Newristics, is that we had a unified message platform across HCP and consumers, which was the objective that we were trying to achieve, across 3 dominant heuristics that emerged out of the studies. And the united or unified message platform was around this triple benefit framework that we had of there was faster onset, longer lasting, and that the product keeps improving over time. That was really important. So you have this triple benefit framework, and then also consistent results without the dependency was it was important for both HCPs and consumers, as was flexible dosing on the product. So when you look across what were the heuristics that were driving that, is first you look at compromising, then positive outcome bias, and complication bias. And these were the 3 leading heuristics that led most of those 20 heuristics in all. So compromising really is something that humans want to have it all, but they don't want to give up anything to get there. So this is basically, they want, humans want all or nothing. So that, and they really want it all, or kind of go big or go home. And that's really what the compromising heuristic really is. When you look at positive outcome bias, this is where we expect actions to produce better outcomes than they actually do. So that is something that people want, they're usually looking for higher expectations than they actually can get. And then complication bias is that easy is usually better, is that patients tend to use look for simple decisions rather than complicated decisions. So they want kind of the easier way out. So when we pull together all of these winning message or the message bundles and the winning message bundles between HCPs and consumers, the product X and the message bundles that we tested were significantly better on both consumer or HCP on the left and consumer on the right to all the other competitive products that we tested in the market. So there's the market leader that we tested better than. And although that it only appears it's a 2 percentage point difference, these two differences are statistically significant in that improvement. It's better than the legacy generic product as well as class entry 1 and 2 that it tested better than. When you look at consumer, the only really shift in difference here was that the market leader is at 20%, we're at 25%, so there's a broader spread statistically, and that class entry 2 is also seen as attractive. But again, the message bundle that we have going forward, working with Newristics and the heuristic-based messaging, is ready to go and is testing far better than the current messages that are available to our competitive products. So from here, I'm going to just turn it back over to Gaurav to continue through the remaining part of the presentation. But thanks for the opportunity.
So let's do a quick recap on what we've learned about from this session and about this kind of new innovative approach of using behavioral science or decision heuristic science and AI to test your messages differently. Behavioral science, if you use it in message testing, is going to allow you to do several things you can't do today. You can test more or a lot of messages. This improves your chances of finding winning messaging campaigns. More you test, the better the chance that you will find a truly outstanding answer. Get better data on each message. Using decision heuristic science, you can get more differentiation, more discrimination in message scores, and this can be very helpful when you're making decisions. Get the appeal of every message without having to ask any diagnostic questions. This helps you figure out why your message bundles and story flows are the way they are. And then when you're ready for a refresh, you would know what heuristics to write to, and you almost don't need to go do additional rounds of foundational research to get insights. AI applied to the data from the research can also give you some huge benefits. It helps you identify the deliverables of the research are no longer living in a PowerPoint file and that need to be translated into campaigns with a lot of judgment. You can be more campaign ready. Create more personalized campaign, get down to the segment level, subgroup level, get down to the channel level, reduce marketing waste. If you think about how messaging is being executed in the marketplace, so much has changed over the last 10 years, but how the messages are tested in market research and what the deliverable looks like, they're not in sync with what the complexity of the executional channels, it has what it reflects in the marketplace. Finally, and this is something that is definitely very helpful for launch teams or even in-market teams, you test a number of messages. Now you have the results. Those messages now change because legal forced some changes or the data was different than what you expected, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes the changes are little bitty changes and you're okay. You have no problems. Okay, you can just use the research and the findings. But other times the changes seem bigger. And now you're even worried about, is my research, whatever the results of the research were, are they even now applicable or reliable? And then what do? Do you go back into research and test all over again? You don't have time or budget for that. You do quick and dirty microsurvey research or to a few IDIs. That doesn't sound like a great idea either. So in this case, using AI, because you tested so many messages in the original first round of research, you can actually use the data from that to train models just based on that data set, which can then predict scores for these newer edited versions of messages. You don't have to go back into research. and this can come in very handy in so many cases. So just that we wanted to kind of highlight the benefits of using behavioral science and artificial intelligence in message testing to basically drive better messaging, more successful messaging campaigns in the market. Hopefully this was something that will help you in your kind of message development and message testing plans that are coming up in the near future. Thank you for joining us. Just once again, quickly reminding, this was a session on how innovation in market research can help drive messaging campaigns. And Dan and I thank you for joining us. And you can actually, if you're just finishing up watching this watching this presentation, you can join a live Q&A where we would be available to just kind of, have a conversation about what we just presented. And the link is right below the video, and you are welcome to join now. Thanks a lot again for joining.